Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Gavriluk, and I'm facilitating the series of lectures that are sponsored by the Theology Department at the University of St. Thomas. The title of the series is New Frontiers in Theological Research. Our today's lecture is also being co-sponsored by the Science and Theology Network that Professor Philip Rolnick coordinates. It's my distinct pleasure to present our speaker today. Philip Rolnick received his doctorate from Duke University in 1989 and subsequently taught at Greensboro College in North Carolina from 1989 to 2003, after which time he came to the University of St. Thomas and has taught for us since 2003. He's presently professor of theology and serves as chair, as I mentioned, of Science and Theology Network, which is a group that promotes public events and faculty research in science and theology in the Twin Cities. Professor Rolnick is the author of many theological books and articles, and his three major research areas concern the following. The doctrine of analogy, and that is the understanding of how words refer to God, specifically in application to the theology of Thomas Aquinas. He also has authored a book on personhood under the title Person, Grace, and God, and especially the book tackling the question of what personhood means for the Christian faith. And most recently, he's been actively involved as a researcher in the questions relating science and theology, the subject of today's presentation. Professor Rolnick has been the recipient of the Exemplary Teacher Award of Greensboro College. He's also been a recipient of several Templeton Foundation grants. And those of you who work in the area of science and theology know how significant that foundation is for research in these two areas. He's also been a North Carolina Humanities Scholar, and most recently, he won a prestigious University Scholars Grant at the University of St. Thomas, and the book under discussion today is a result of this particular grant. He's been a member of Princeton's Center of Theological Inquiry community, and also most recently a participant in Notre Dame's seminar on human distinctiveness. In his talk tonight for the New Frontiers lecture series and Science and Theology Network, Professor Rolnick will present a lecture entitled Naturalism and Transcendence, a Debate About Science. This talk will highlight themes from his new book, Origins, God, Evolution, and the Question of the Cosmos, published by Baylor University Press this year. After Professor Rolnick's presentation, there will be a question and answer session. So I would ask you to think about the questions as you listen to the lecture and also record them on the cards that you've been provided. And if you don't have a card, the students standing on the back will give you a copy of the card, and then we will subsequently collect those and bring them to the podium after the lecture. In the foyer after the lecture and outside of the auditorium, there will be a book signing session during a small reception after the question and answer period. We are particularly thankful to all of our guests who came outside of the community of St. Thomas from off campus, and especially to Northwestern students. I understand that we have many of them with us today. Can I get a shout? Yeah. Well, without further ado, please welcome Professor Rolnick.
Well, good evening. Let's see if we can get this. There we are. Science has taught us many things about the material universe that Moses and the Apostle Paul did not know. For example, advances in molecular biology have uncovered worlds within worlds, tucked into the tiniest imaginable spaces, And within these minuscule worlds, organized life-promoting activities rival the hustle and bustle of major American cities. And in the macrocosm, advances in astronomy have revealed a vast and expanding universe in which our sun and moon and our planetary home are but pinpricks within the galactic immensity. The Earth, here's a look of the Carina Nebula, and we're just literally a pinprick. This is part of the Milky Way, and we're just a pinprick of the Milky Way. The Earth can no longer be understood as the center of a universe governed by what has been called a one-planet deity. This was actually something like the picture that you see. The picture you see here is something like what the ancient Hebrews priests who wrote Genesis chapter 1, somewhere in the 6th century BC, influenced by Babylonian science. That's something like the picture of the universe, the cosmology that they actually had. But in the large and the small, in the microcosm, macrocosm, everything is now expanded. Everything is now far more complex than this. So science has given us a new picture of the cosmos, and science has established itself as the pinnacle of contemporary reason. However, there's a very high stakes debate on about how to interpret science. As Sir John Polkinghorne once said, the components of the material universe do not arrive with a stamp made by God. So there's a hard work of interpretation that must be done, and understandably, people interpret these things quite differently. In fact, the debate tends to go in two directions. The debate on one side, and it's the title of our talk tonight, is naturalism. And on the other side is some kind of religious belief that something transcends nature. So there's could be called a fractal structure to the interpretative debate. A fractal is a pattern that occurs in nature. And this pattern, once it's set, will reoccur at ever and ever and ever smaller scales. So no matter how many times one repeats the pattern. So for instance, up here in the upper left, this inverted white triangle is surrounded by 3 black triangles, and that is surrounded by a triangular shape itself. This pattern can be repeated here, and here, and here, and here, and here. That is a fractal pattern. Now, I'm using the term fractal as a metaphor for the interpretative pattern of disagreement that typically arises when the scientific data is being interpreted. In fact, this fractal structure, which was theologian Philip Clayton's term originally, is really interesting because every time a new scientific discovery arises, this fractal pattern of disagreement tends to come with it. So just a bit about each of these. Naturalism is a philosophy, really, that recognizes nothing beyond nature. Naturalism assumes that only nature is real, and therefore the only real explanations, the only explanations that count, are about natural causes and effects. On the other hand, on the other side of the fractal divide, the religious interpretation recognizes something transcendent. Transcendent means something that is above or beyond nature, that is in the very midst of nature. In what follows, I'll show that there's nothing in contemporary science that in any direct way disproves faith. But there is a great deal in contemporary science that is highly compatible with faith and supportive of faith. But first, let's elaborate what naturalism and belief in transcendence are. According to naturalism, since nature is the only reality, The scientific study of nature is the only real form of knowledge. Naturalism is a totalistic way of perceiving the world. In naturalism, religion is simply a mass of irrelevant error. Religion tells us about something that does not exist, according to naturalism, because it's something beyond the natural world. The presuppositions of naturalism ensure that there will be conflict with religious belief. Belief in creation is ruled out from the get-go, and belief in Christ is relegated to the la-la land of religious superstition. However, one of my purposes tonight is to show that naturalism itself, which prides itself on being a kind of a hard-headed look at the facts, is actually based on multiple beliefs. And here are some of those beliefs. First, that the universe exists on its own. Now, existence is no small thing. In fact, you could say that existence is almost everything, because if you don't exist, existence is the start of anything that would count. To say that the universe exists on its own, that there is no explanation and there can be no explanation for how the universe comes into existence, is a major presupposition of naturalism. It's a belief. Secondly, it's believed in naturalism that the universe generates its own order and its own laws and intelligibility. Third, that it keeps itself in being. It maintains itself in being. It never goes out of being. It continues to exist. So in naturalism, the universe itself is never beginning, never ending. Now that may sound like rather godlike characteristics, and in fact, they are godlike characteristics. They are characteristics that are often attributed to God, never beginning and never ending. But this kind of lowercase g God has no consciousness, and yet it is believed that, that this universe can produce beings like us who do have consciousness. So, to summarize the naturalistic position, advocates of naturalism have clearly not rid themselves of belief. They've only concentrated their belief on the material universe itself. Otherwise, they are known as reductionists, because what the naturalist wants to do is reduce everything down to one level, the level of nature. Now, naturalism, in a way, pays an unintended compliment to the Creator, whose existence is denied, but whose universe is so greatly extolled. Well, conflict is necessarily going to come between naturalism and religious belief. But on the other side, conflict will also be generated by religious fundamentalism. Both attitudes, naturalism and fundamentalism, have something totalistic about them. They leave little room, little space for other disciplines. They don't play well with others. So, in these two, if you have biblical inerrancy, even about science, or if you have inerrancy about church doctrine, even about science, there will be conflict. But I believe we can do better than conflict. And the Catholic Church and mainline Protestant churches and many others do actually adopt a position that does allow dialogue, and that will be the general trend of tonight's talk. The scientific story and the religious story actually have a lot in common. They are both about truth. Now let us define truth as, quote, contact with reality, end quote. A definition, I believe, first put down by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, later used by Michael Polanyi to great effect. But it's a wonderful definition, because if truth is about contact with reality, it's not about who makes up the most clever scheme. It's about a response to or a discovery of the way reality actually is. And that can happen on the level of nature, culture, or spirit. Now, just to clarify one point that is sometimes unclear for people, it's really the difference between epistemology and metaphysics for those of you who have studied philosophy, but it's just this: science is not nature. Science is not even natural. Science is a human achievement that transcends nature. The thoughts that scientists think are not part of the cause and effect realm of the natural world. And just getting that means that the very pursuit of science is a participation in transcendence. And from a faith perspective, science can become a wonderful partner, a newcomer to the ancient religious quest that Jesus put so well: you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. So, to summarize this little section, incorporating scientific truth into our religious outlook is really a grand opportunity for the religion and faith of our time. It's a way to reawaken and revivify faith. In physics, chemistry, and biology, scientists have progressively uncovered such profound order and such intricate detail that's understandable and reason within things, that this has led to a basic religious intuition and a question, which is, what is it that makes order and intelligibility, understandability, possible in the first place? Well, similar questions were asked by two Nobel-winning prize scientists, Eugene Wigner and the famous Albert Einstein. Wigner wrote an article in which he asked, why is mathematics so effective? What is it about mathematics, an activity of the human mind, that can map onto the physical world so effectively? Now, many people just assume, well, it just does. But Wigner, this Nobel Prize-winning scientist, stopped and he said, why? Should we just assume that that's the case? Is it necessarily the case? So he asked this question, and then Einstein asked a similar question, or really implied when he said, the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. So you can take these things for granted, but you ought not to. You could imagine a universe where things weren't comprehensible. And apparently Wigner and Einstein did just that. However, if the universe is created by God, mathematical effectiveness should be expected. And the human ability to understand things is right on schedule. If God created, there is a reason that there is reason, a cause of all causality, and an initiating purpose that makes all subsequent purpose possible. From the faith side of the fractal divide, the universe can be scientifically explored only because it originates in a creator of infinite intelligence. Scientific reason is thus not a lucky accident, as it must be in naturalism, nor is scientific reason a flicker of virtuosity played out on an ultimately meaningless universe stage. Instead, science is a rational activity, rationally applied to a universe imbued with its own rationality. Now, as a human response, science and the rational applications of science really are a participation in what the ancient Greeks called the Logos, and which was written about by the great Jewish scholar Philo, whom our own John Martins has written about so beautifully. But Logos also appears in the opening of the Gospel of John. Now, you know the opening of the Gospel of John in the following way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Wonderful translation, no problem there. But if you go to the original Greek, you will find an arche ein hologos. In the beginning was the logos. Now, what did logos mean to the Greeks? It meant reason. It meant the foundation of reason, the cause of reason. And when the Gospel of John places it so significantly just in these first few verses, in the prologue of the Gospel of John, John is linking up with the ancient Greek tradition, with Philo and the Greek tradition before him, and going beyond them. And he's suggesting that in the very creation of the universe, all of it is imbued with logos, with the logos of God. So, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. The logos was in the beginning with God. All things came into being. So here we are back to all things came into being through the logos. And without the logos, not one thing came into being. So all of creation in this vision of the Gospel of John is imprinted with the divine reason. It has a share of divine reason, and because of that, all of creation is understandable scientifically because of the logos inside the fabric of things and the logos inside the human mind. And there's a match between the logos inside the human mind and the logos inside the fabric of things. And when those two meet up, as they sometimes do, they don't always meet up, but when they do, it's a wonderful thing. There's this burst of understanding and this aha moment, and sometimes we call that science. Okay, so since all things come into being through the logos, the reason or mind of God, and all creation is imprinted with a share of this divine reason, all created things act according to principles of reason and can be scientifically discovered. So what we've just done is established a religious basis, a foundation in the Gospel of John, in this ancient Logos doctrine, for the very possibility of science. And when science is thus interpreted as a sign of transcendence, as a sign of logos, as a participation in the logos, science becomes a very, very helpful partner to religious faith. Here's some other ways that logos plays out in the university. You have the geologos, the logos of the earth, biologos, the logos of life, sociologos, the logos of civilization and society, anthropology, the logos of what it means to be a human being, and finally, theologos, the logos of God. So in some ways, I always like to say that I think logos is the most important single term that can be learned in a university, perhaps anywhere. All right, well, with this background established, we're now ready to look at 3 test cases: Big Bang cosmology, fine-tuning, and evolution. First test case: the origin of the universe from a physical point of view, from a scientific point of view. The origin of the universe. Big Bang theory is a theory about how the universe originated. Now, according to this theory, there was an event, an episode of what physicists call a singularity. In a singularity, the laws of physics utterly break down because it's an event of infinite heat, pressure, density in zero space. You can't even picture it. And you can't even graph it mathematically. But that is the basic claim of Big Bang theory. And out of this Big Bang, all matter, which is easy, everybody knows matter must have originated at the beginning, but also all energy, all space, and all time originate in this originating event, this singularity of the Big Bang. Now, another basic fact about the Big Bang was thought to be a hot explosion. But the Big Bang's not a normal explosion. In a normal explosion, things fly apart. In the Big Bang, the word explosion is almost used metaphorically because it's not making things fly apart. It's taking the very fabric of space and time and stretching it, Imagine a large rubber band of some sort and just stretching it out. That's essentially what the Big Bang has done to space and time. And as it stretches, it cools as it moves apart from the originating explosive point. So, and as it expands, it takes everything with it. Everything in space kind of goes along for the ride. All right, so the success of Big Bang theory was a big surprise for most physicists, and a rather unhappy one at that. At first, Big Bang was a term of derision. It was a put down. It was mockery, actually coined by the great physicist Fred Hoyle, the British physicist, who favored a different theory. And so it was like, ooh, Big Bang, you know, he's like, you know. But it's one of those terms of derision that has stuck and has actually fired the imaginations of everyone since. So here you see, this is actually a photo of the Hubble Space Telescope, one of the magnificent technological achievements of modern times, and it has just given a treasure trove of scientific information, and scientists from all over the world are allowed to apply and ask for time to run experiments with this, but it's been bringing in all kinds of great information. Now, the Hubble Space Telescope was named after this gentleman, whom you see in the lower left there. That's Edwin Hubble. This is in 1929, and you see him pictured at Mount Wilson Observatory, where there was at the time the greatest technological achievement of 1929, the 100-inch telescope that was peering out into the cosmos. Just a magnificent thing. Well, Hubble worked with a former wagon wheel repairman named Humason, and these two guys made painstaking analyses of what was going on astronomically. And they discovered something very, very strange. Do you know the Doppler effect? How many of you know the Doppler effect? Okay, good. So in the Doppler effect, for those of you who don't know it, well, you've all experienced it. It's if you're standing still and an emergency vehicle is approaching you, say an ambulance. As the ambulance is approaching, the sound is compressed. The sound is a wave, and its waves are compressed. As the ambulance is leaving, is moving away from you, the sound waves are stretched out. Now, I mention sound waves because light is also a wave. And what Edwin Hubble discovered, and one of the great scientific discoveries of the 20th century, is that all the light in the universe is not light approaching us, it's light moving away. And it's moving away not just from us, but from everything else. This is what's called red-shifted light. So imagine that you're the observer, standing still. You're the green dot in the upper left there. And the light source here, the light source, say, of a distant galaxy is moving toward you. But that light source itself is moving away. And as it moves away, the light spreads out. The light is spread out, and that's what is called redshifting. If the light were moving toward you, which it's not doing, here in the bottom part of the picture there, if the light source, say the galaxy was approaching us, the light would be blue shifted, and the waves would be more compressed. So what Hubble discovered was that everything in the galaxy is moving away from everything else, which is a magnificent discovery, and it was the first great clue that Big Bang was not just some wild theory that, whoa, this is serious, because it means that if everything is moving away from everything else, there must have been an initial explosion that made it move, that made everything move out. Now, there were still arguments about it, but those arguments ended in 1965 with these two gentlemen here. On your left, you see Arno Penzias, and on your right, you see Robert Wilson. These two Nobel Prize winners discovered what was called the cosmic microwave background radiation, and they did it in that massive thing behind them that at the time was the world's largest radio telescope. So these guys were listening for signals from outer space, but they kept getting this static, this really annoying static like you get on a radio. So they climbed up into that monstrosity there, and they discovered a nest of pigeons that had left this white dielectric material, pigeon poop. So they cleaned up the pigeon poop and dispatched the pigeons. There's some controversy about the ultimate fate of those pigeons. But anyway, the pigeons were gone, the poop was gone, but the static continued. And they looked at each other and said, okay, we're on to something. So they go up to Princeton, which is just maybe, I don't know, this is in New Jersey at the Bell Labs. And Princeton's not far from there. So they go up and they are at a conference with these two major physicists from Princeton who were actually looking for what these two guys had found, the cosmic microwave background radiation. And no matter where you look, everywhere in space, from Australia, from Iceland, from Mexico, or if you're on that Hubble Space Telescope, or if the Hubble Space Telescope, that's one of the things it keeps looking at and looking for is new measurements of the cosmic microwave background radiation. Now, the cosmic microwave background radiation could only have come from one place, and that is a very hot early universe, because it's everywhere. A single galaxy couldn't have produced it. This made Big Bang the scientific consensus. Everybody now believes that the universe began in a hot Big Bang. So you say, oh, well, the controversy's over then between naturalism and transcendence. No. Instead, and this is not to say that this is the only motivation for this. I don't believe it is. A naturalist can say, well, okay, the Big Bang is the beginning of our universe, but maybe there are all kinds of universes beyond our universe, multiple universes, maybe even an infinite number of universes that have always existed and always will exist. And this is what's now called the multiverse. Now, the problem with the multiverse is that there's not a shred of proof. There's no proof whatsoever for it. And so far, nobody's even found a way to even investigate how to get any proof. So it may be permanently beyond us. But at the moment, anyway, Big Bang is the consensus. Now, Big Bang does not prove that God created the universe, but it's about as compatible of a development as you could possibly ask for from science. You can't ask science to do your faith for you. But if you want compatibility, this is it. So, doesn't prove it, but it's very good for us. Now, very good for people of faith, very disturbing to the scientists. Let me read you a few of the things that famous scientists said when this theory started to be taken seriously. First, the great German chemist Walter Nernst. I quote, "To deny the infinite duration of time would be to betray the very foundation of science," end quote. Likewise, American astronomer Alan Sandage said of the Big Bang, "It's such a strange conclusion. It cannot really be true." In 1931, Arthur Eddington, British physicist and a believing Quaker, nonetheless wrote, "The notion of a beginning is repugnant to me. I simply do not believe that the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe is preposterous, incredible. It leaves me cold." Scientists who want to explain everything scientifically are understandably upset by discovering that the universe has a beginning that must necessarily escape scientific explanations. Walter Jastrow, a Dartmouth physics professor who worked with NASA, was an agnostic, but he had a great sense of humor. And he really saw great humor in the way all his fellow physicists were so deeply bothered by this Big Bang. And he said about Big Bang success, I quote, "This is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians." Jastrow, who could have had a career as a stand-up comic, then drew this picture. "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, The story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. So Big Bang theory has become what Stephen Barr, the Catholic astrophysicist, calls a plot twist in the relation of science and theology. Well, let's go to the second test case, fine-tuning. Let me explain fine-tuning briefly this way. Imagine that you have been sentenced to death by firing squad, and 50 of the world's greatest marksmen are aiming their rifles at you because you were bad, politically or something. Okay, so these 50 of the world's greatest marksmen all ready, aim, fire, and they all miss. Now that's extremely improbable, but fine-tuning is the discovery of physical phenomena that are far, far less probable than that you could survive that firing squad. So let me show you some instances of this. First, this first instance, these calculations come from the physicist Paul Davies. Now that's a 1 with 60 zeros after it. That's 10 to the 60th power. That's an enormous number. It's hyper-astronomical. But Davies calculated that the explosive outward force of the Big Bang, just after the Big Bang, in the micro moments after the Big Bang, that explosive outward force and the force of gravity were balanced to 1 part in 10 to the 60th power. Now, that's pretty unlikely. But the way it works is if gravity had been just any part of that number stronger, it would have sucked everything back in. Had it been a little bit weaker or the explosive force a little stronger, everything would have flown apart so fast that there would be no interaction, no galaxies, no life, no planet, no you and me. So there are two calamitous events. Both of them are missed, and they're missed by this ridiculous balance of 1 part in 10 to the 60th power. This is the epitome of fine-tuning. Then physicists have also calculated that in the micro moments after the Big Bang, the universe was like a hot little fireball in which particles and antiparticles are slamming into each other. When particles and antiparticles slam into each other, they destroy each other entirely. Well, it turns out that for every 1 billion particles of antimatter, there are 1,000,000,001 particles of matter. So another narrow escape, another fine-tuning, and the universe develops. Finally, a third case. There's 15 or 20. I just want to do these 3, and then we'll move on. Entropy. Now, entropy is one of these hotly contested issues in science. But if you look at this cup here, this cup has low entropy because it's useful. Entropy is a form of disorder. You can put things in this cup, you can do things with this cup, but you notice this cup seems to be moving. When the cup gets down here, it has what's called high entropy because it no longer has the same usefulness that it had before, and most of the universe is moving from low entropy to higher entropy. That's the second law of thermodynamics within a closed system. Okay, so here's another instance of entropy. Well, another physicist, Roger Penrose, calculated the probability of the extremely low entropy at the Big Bang. And this number is just, this is so hyper-astronomical, it's just absurd. 1 over 10 to the 10 to the 123rd. This is crazy numbers. But these are the numbers without which you wouldn't have a universe, you and I wouldn't be here. This is what fine-tuning is all about. So, to summarize fine-tuning, fine-tuning does not prove the existence of God and that God created the universe. But from the faith side of the fractal divide, we don't want proof. We only want compatibility. And like Big Bang, fine-tuning gives us a great deal of compatibility. It's really a benefit to the faith of our time. All right, let's go to the third case. Oh, where we go? Oh, you want to go? Let me tell you about those monkeys. There's a trope that's out there where in the argument between naturalism and believers in transcendence, people say, well, you know, these numbers are funny, but if you had infinite time, or if you had all kinds of time, and you just put monkeys at a typewriter, or chimpanzees who are even smarter than monkeys, and you put them at the typewriter and just let them type randomly, then eventually one of them will type Shakespeare's Hamlet. Yeah, some of you are smiling. I don't believe it either. And there was actually an Israeli scientist named, I believe, Gerhard Schroeder, who actually ran a test. And they put some monkeys on computers for a month or so. And the numbers just didn't work. It turned out to be some kind of real monkey business, but it didn't work. Now, Schroeder said, let's up the ante and let's say we did it with computers trying to generate this Shakespeare's Hamlet at random. Didn't work. Wouldn't work in the entire time of the universe, and it wouldn't work in the entire time the universe is projected to remain in existence. So the only way you can save the monkeys, if you want to be a naturalist and say, well, those monkeys would type Shakespeare if they had infinite time, you have to go back to the multiverse. But again, use Occam's razor on this. Occam's razor says you don't multiply difficulties, you take the shortest route to the goal as a philosophical explanation, and this isn't it. Okay. Third test case, evolution. Now, in some ways, evolution seems like the toughest test case, and I must say, there's just not going to be sufficient time tonight to do a detailed analysis of evolution's challenges and the theological responses. Doing so would require multiple evenings of lectures, 4 or 5, and it is the subject of part 1 of my book, Origins. But the following very brief account will show that evolution is not all dark and dreary and worrisome for people of faith. First, think about what evolution is. Now let's start, as we did in our 101 class the other day. Evolution is not creation. It's not making any claims about creation. Evolution is about how species change over time. But evolution presupposes a universe. It presupposes structure. Evolution has only been going on for 3.45 billion years. But the universe, as you know, is 13.8 billion years old. That's the most recent and most accurate dating of the Big Bang, 13.8 billion. So you have about a 10 billion year history of the universe before evolution even gets started, but upon which evolution utterly depends and without which evolution cannot even start. And that 10 billion years history includes the Big Bang, as improbable as it was, and fine-tuning, as improbable as that was. Then you get to something like the lifespan of the sun, our sun. Lifespan of our sun is about 10 billion years. It's currently about halfway through its lifespan. Now, imagine that the lifespan of the sun was only 1 million years or 100 million years, and evolution is 3.45 billion years. It takes 3.45 billion years to produce humanity in an evolutionary setting. Well, you don't have enough time then. But it just works out, and this is another one of those fine-tuning things, that the lifespan of the sun fits the lifespan of evolution. Now think one more thing about evolution. All evolutionary biologists agree that life began on Earth as single-celled bacteria, different forms of bacteria. Now to go from bacteria to algae, pond scum, to the person sitting next to you, that's a pretty good accomplishment. Now, if evolution can get that done, I say, wow, we might be looking at an episode of the creativity of creation. Moreover, evolution produces beauty and strength. Look at this insect here. I mean, the camouflage of this remarkable creature. And if evolution can do that, to give this being a way of protecting itself so that it can survive, not get eaten by a bird, and live long enough to reproduce and get its genes into the next generation, if that's what evolution is doing, it's doing something wonderful. It's producing beauty, it's producing adaptability, and it's producing strength. And here, you see this beautiful mammalian love of mama chimp and baby. And here, you see it in our species, in Homo sapiens. Now, you could say, well, she's just an advanced chimp. If you were a naturalist, you might say, well, you're just really an advanced chimp. But I don't believe that. I believe that in us, and in us alone, humans uniquely, mother love is a preparation for the gospel of Christ. It's a preparation for learning to love, to becoming part of a kingdom of love. And you could do this with any other species, and they don't love other people, especially people who don't look like them or people they may not like. But this is part of the gospel of Christ. But without this mother love, you won't get it. So my point is this: the transcendence is rooted in the biology. The transcendence isn't floating free. It's in the biological world. The biological world itself is good. Finally, as evolution teaches discipline, because creatures that are not disciplined do not survive. So here's one of my favorite quotes from the Old Testament. For whom the Lord, do not despise the Lord's discipline and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and the Father, the Son, he delights in. And finally, there you see the Olympic motto, swifter, higher, stronger. And think about how unnatural it is to swim the butterfly. That is a tremendous cultural achievement. That is an episode of human transcendence in the athletic world. So evolution keeps the biosphere strong, and athletics is a human adaptation that in many ways imitates the biology, but without the life and death consequences. When you lose a race, they don't kill you. Well, there is a teaching of Jesus, the parable of the talents, that I think fits evolution because it makes demands on us the same way evolution does. Now, in the parable of the talents, as many of my students will be able to tell you, a master calls his 3 servants together, and he gives each of them a certain amount of money. Talent was an enormous amount of money. To one he gives 5 talents, to one 2, and to the third one 1, each according to his ability. And then the master goes off for a long time. And presumably each of the servants is to develop things while he's gone. When the master comes back, he demands an account. The one who received 5 talents dutifully and intelligently worked with his 5 and made 5 more, gives them to the master. The master says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a few things. You'll be made Lord over many. Enter into the joy of your master. Same kind of story with the one who had 2 talents, does very well, doubles them. Enter into the joy of your master. But the punchline of the story in many ways comes with the third one, who buries his 1 talent in the ground. A beautifully striking image that Jesus portrays there. And then he hands it back to the master and he gives him a bad speech about what a bad guy he is, trying to reap where he didn't sow. And this servant gets thrown into the outer darkness and severely punished. So, what's the takeaway from the parable of the talents, and how does it fit evolution? Well, it's pretty simple. No stagnation, no standing still. You must develop what you've been given. You cannot just hand it back the way it's come to you. So, do y'all recognize what that is? Yeah, what is that? The footprint on the moon. Now you think about what it took to get to that footprint on the moon. It's easy to fail. It's easy to lose. It's really hard to do that. That took teamwork. That took character. That took social cooperation. That took intelligent planning. That took a fundamental respect for reality. And we did that. That's pretty good. And there's something about that, and there's something about evolution that teaches you, don't be lazy, don't do status quo, try to get better. It's the perfect parable, in a way, for education. Winning and losing are part of the evolutionary world. More tamely, with fewer life and death consequences, they're part of human civilization, and greatly transformed, they're part of Jesus' gospel. Because Jesus' gospel is ultimately about the greatest possible win, the greatest possible victory, about entering into what has been called, I quote, the fellowship of eternal happiness. Well, joining faith with scientific understanding has been the purpose of this lecture, and it is the purpose of Origins, the book upon which this lecture has been largely based. But allow me, if you will, allow me a couple minutes to give you some concluding reflections. The debate between naturalism and transcendence is really a debate about reason. In naturalism, reason is necessarily encircled by absurdity. Because according to naturalism, human appearance, the human coming to existence, has to be accidental, unintended, and temporary, just like the galactic structures that support our existence. If naturalism accurately describes the way things are, it would not be good news, not even for those who hold the position. Naturalism is in essence a way of betting against one's own self. But if reason, including scientific reason, derives from the original logos of the Creator God, then human reason is a sign of transcendence, a bestowed talent, a capacity for pursuing meaningful purpose now and in eternity. That God created has long been a belief of Christians and other monotheists. But this belief, if prodded, if questioned and examined, too often will betray an underlying flimsiness. The problem is many people believe in creation, but it's something so distant, so far away, kind of misty and vague, that ultimately it's ineffective in shaping life performance. The good news is recent scientific studies like Big Bang, fine-tuning, and especially evolution have revealed details about the created cosmos that can give belief in creation a new solidity. It's almost as if the science is now a way of putting some flesh on the skeletal bones of belief in creation. In the 6th century BC, the Hebrew priests who wrote the book of Genesis provided an inspired view of the origin and purpose of the cosmos. But the science of our age lets us see a universe even more beautiful, with its discoverable laws displaying an awe-inspiring rationality, the logos of creation. Now, my hope is that the dialogue of science and religion will bring people to faith who do not yet have it. And for those who already have it, my hope is that the dialogue between science and religion will confirm faith, strengthen faith, and deepen faith. Like the servant in Jesus' parable, the one given 5 talents, theology has now been given an exceedingly great gift by science. What we do with that gift as a generation, and in a sense what you do with that gift, is perhaps one of the great tests spiritually of our time. But rightly approached, scientific discoveries can help us, once again, to fall in love with creation. Thank you for your attention tonight.
Well, Professor Rolnick, thank you very much for this very rich intellectual feast that you've laid out for us. I'm sure that none of us would go hungry after what you've heard. We now have plenty of time for a question and answer period. And if I could ask the 2 student helpers to help us to collect the cards with the questions at this point. Do we have the student helpers? Let me perhaps then do the collecting myself. Oh, are they coming? Oh, they're coming. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, while we're collecting questions, if I could just elaborate on if you could elaborate on one point that you were developing, and that is the claim that you made about multiverses, because I mean much of what you've discussed is the whole question of a theistic explanation versus naturalistic explanation. So you made a claim that multiverses, there's no proof for multiverses, right? But then the theistic explanation is fundamentally compatible with what we know about the Big Bang. Is this? I mean, could you expand on that particular point?
Yes, there's nothing wrong with a multiverse. There's a lot of brilliant physicists who are exploring and writing books about and speculations about the multiverse. So let's assume for the moment that a multiverse would actually be discovered. I think that's entirely possible. At that point, the debate, the fractal divide of interpretation, it's on again, the same way, because there would still be a requirement to explain why the multiverse was working. So you'd push everything back one step, but you wouldn't solve it. So I don't think that, once again, I don't think we want proof from science. People of faith, it's a grand mistake to try to prove God from your scientific belief. If you get compatibility, then just call it a victory and go home. Well, here's some other questions. Is it possible that science itself can be corrupted by politics? Yes. Definitely. If everything is created with logos, why do people have different logic? Oh, great question. Okay, they have different logics because, I think different people have different capacities. You know, every one of us is not Albert Einstein or Eugene Wigner. It takes a lot to be able to do that kind of work, or just, you know, even to be able to do the kind of calculus classes, 3-4 levels of calculus that are required here at St. Thomas, and I know you do at Northwestern. These are disciplines of the mind. Everybody doesn't have that. Others have other gifts. But it's also the case that sometimes human beings bend reality to the way we want reality to go. Well, reality does not cooperate with you when you do that. Reality is just itself. And the only way you're going to do something creative and interesting is by cooperating with the reality that's there. And that's another way of saying contact with reality is truth. Great question, though. All right, what if the servant in the parable of the talents inverts and loses everything through no fault of his own, how should we react? Well, now you're writing a different parable than the one Jesus did. Now that's okay, and that could be a lot of fun. And I think this is a good question, and it might be really fun to sit around and really honestly to discuss that, and should. You could do it different ways. So maybe a nice class exercise is write your own parables, and this would be a very good one in that. So I suspect, allow me a theological moment here. One of the things I'm quite sure about God is that whatever else God is fair. Human beings, human judges, human teachers make mistakes. We do not get it 100% right 100% of the time. I think God is the one being in the world who does, who's not even in the world, thank you. But, so if through no fault of his own a servant did that, I believe he would be treated fairly. Here's another question. Why say Big Bang and fine-tuning only show compatibility with creation? Don't they provide evidence for it? Well, probably. You could probably put it more strongly than I've dared to. And you could make a case for that and argue for that, and some very smart people like Father Robert Spitzer, in fact, did do that. Another question, did Jesus really mean the truth as fact or reality? What about the truth as an unexplainable? The Holy Spirit. Well, the Holy Spirit is not wholly unexplainable. The Holy Spirit, if it were, we wouldn't be able to say anything about it at all, even that there is a Holy Spirit. So to say that we don't know everything is not the same as to say that we know nothing. As St. Thomas, after whom this university is named, once said, we know very little, but what we know is precious. All right, and here's the question. What created the pressure, heat, density, and what created that thing, and so forth? And that's exactly why so many scientists were bothered by it at the time, because it certainly invites you to say, it's a version of what's called the cosmological argument. It invites you to say, well, it didn't create itself. So it's very theologically friendly. When a dinosaur bone is broken open and soft tissue is found, i.e. elastic blood vessels, what does that tell you? I honestly don't know, but okay. But I'd like to think about it. Okay. Does God predispose females, both human and non-human, to be nurturing? If only humans have the capability to study and worship God and his gospels, then why are non-human females also nurturing? Naturally, that is. Well, there's a wonderful writer, Franz de Waal, at the Arnhem Zoo in Atlanta. And de Waal wrote a book called Good Natured, by which he meant that nature itself is good. And while I have my disagreements with Professor de Waal, I think he's absolutely right. We don't have to deny all the goodness in nature and say that only human beings are capable of any goodness and nurturing. I find it exquisite that monkeys can love other monkeys, but I find it celestial that human beings can love people on the other side of the planet. If many people accept the bouncing theory, I'm going to have to explain that one, where the universe will bounce back and another Big Bang will happen, Earth being destroyed with everything being destroyed on it, why should we believe in a God that may have created the universe with the Big Bang, but will destroy it with the bouncing theory? Well, it sounds a little bit like Shiva, the great destroyer in Hinduism, doesn't it? So Shiva is is the destructive force. Well, first thing I would say is that our faith is not in an eternal universe. Our faith is in an eternal God, a person who has promised us eternal life. So whether the universe continues or whether the universe fails because of entropy or because of an oscillation, that would make me very sad. I like the universe. And I mean that, I really do. And I don't want it to be destroyed, and I don't want it to experience a heat death or anything like that. But ultimately, that cannot be the focus of our faith. Okay, question, where does original sin fit into the story? And where does a personal God fit in? Well, let's do the second question first. Where does a personal God fit in? I think that the universe of Logos makes sense. Logos is a deeply personal act by a deeply personal God, which is to say that creation is personal. So you do not live in an impersonal universe. The universe has impersonal laws. It has universal laws. But those laws were created by a person and for persons. As the prophet Isaiah said, he did not create it to be a wasteland. He created it to be inhabited. So I think that the person is at the beginning, middle, and end of the story. Now, where does original sin fit into the story? Well, it doesn't fit into the story I've told. And it's a very difficult part of the story. One of the difficulties scientifically, and our own Ken Kemp has been working on this, is it's very difficult, even anthropologically, to pin down when the first human beings were and where they were and so forth. But as one writer, Friedrich Schleiermacher, said, whoever the first two human beings were would most likely have sinned. That's an inadequate response to a great question, but it's the best I can do at the moment. So, science and faith give rise to truth. To what degree can we trust science, especially, can't make out there, to reveal us truth, for example, Big Bang, since data is compiled by few and scientists who may be biased? Look, bias in science is a problem. It's a very real problem. And I don't think it's a universal problem. Maybe I'm just optimistic, but I believe that most of the scientists I know have told me the truth and have been trustworthy people. There have been famous episodes where people falsified data so that they could look good and get some publicity. Falsifying data is evil. It's wrong. And so I think we need scientists who love truth more than they love their own fame and prosperity. And that's a uniquely religious responsibility, because if we don't raise people to love truth, it's unlikely it will just happen naturally. Is love a product of intelligibility? Well, now that's a fine question. Yeah, you couldn't have love if you didn't have, not human love, not divine love, not the gospel's love, if you didn't have a mind that could understand the other person that you were loving and that was loving you. So understanding another person is, and being understood, is an essential ingredient of love. Well, thank you for these great questions.
We certainly have time for more questions. So if there are some of us who have filled out the cards, I'd be very happy to collect those.
Okay, this is a question about evolutionary psychology. And the question is, what would you say in response to theories such as evolutionary psychology, which claim that religion, like other social phenomena, is a behavior the result of mere adaptation? Is not this incompatible with religious belief? And the answer is yes, it is incompatible with religious belief. The presupposition of the question is a case in point of naturalism and a naturalistic perspective. You can go that route, but you don't have to go that route. And if you go that route, you're betting against yourself. You're betting that your life and the ultimate context of life does not make sense. I've made my bet otherwise. So,
Wonderful.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? Well, thank you very much for coming today and for your attention. As I announced earlier, we will now have a small reception and also book signing. Of course, the lecture itself was only intended to whet your appetite, so there's much more, of course, to be taken from the book itself. So let us once again thank our today's speaker. Thank you.
I may have gone longer.